Those of us who've grown up as Christians have used the term Mother of God for a long time. We're used to it. But stop and think how strange that sounds. The all-holy, immeasurable, imponderable, unknowable source of everything, and Mary is the mother of God. The early church wasn't so sure about this term either for a long time. They weren't sure whether Jesus maybe was adopted by God somewhere along the line, like at John's baptism or during the time in the desert. But eventually, at the Council of Ephesus in 431, they declared Mary Theotokos, Mother of God. And everybody had a big candlelight procession and rejoiced. And basically that from the moment of his conception, Jesus was fully human and fully divine. And Mary can therefore truly be called the Mother of God. The other thing I think we may not think about too much is what it means to call Mary a mother. Those of you who have had children, the women in our community here, there's a bond formed with your child that I'm sure no man can ever understand or experience. Carrying that child in your womb for 9 months, giving birth, and then the child learns everything from the hands of his parents, especially his mother. Learns, among other things, that he's loved, that he's embraced, that he's cared for. Not because he has blue eyes, but just because he's around, just because he exists, just because he's my child. Well, Jesus had to learn all those things from Mary. Jesus learned what it was to be a human being from Mary. Jesus learned what it was to grow up from Mary. Jesus learned the traditions of the Jewish community from Mary and Joseph. He was a child like every other child, went through infancy like every other child, went through toddlership as every other child. And who was there all the while embracing him, wondering what this act of God was all about, but always embracing the moment and caring for her child. You know, that bond between mother and child is perhaps the strongest bond that humanity knows. We experience that sometimes by some terrible criminals, you know. Then they go interview his mother, and her response is, well, he was a good boy, even though he was terrible. Nothing changes that bond. Now, Mary's life was not easy, however. She did not have a totally joyful experience. She was also known as the sorrowful mother. Giving birth in a stranger's area, not so much a stable probably, but relatives' homes where the animals were right next door to the family. Flight into Egypt, run out of town, and then to see her son standing at the foot of the cross, seeing his shameful, terrible, rejected crucifixion, experiencing all of that, and yet always, as the scriptures today said, keeping all these things in her heart, reflecting on what God was about, and responding to whatever God was doing with her or in her life or with her loved ones. Now, we're very busy and scattered, too. Mary was busy, you know, too. She had a busy life. She didn't have any microwaves or dishwashers. You know, in fact, there wasn't any running water. You had to go down to the community well every day to get water for the family. So she had a busy life also, but she wasn't scattered. She wasn't lost in all that busyness. She wasn't lost in the midst of anything, because she had if you want, a quiet center. She had a center where she dwelled with God, where God dwelled with her, where she kept the relationship with God, and where she reflected on what God was doing, even though most of the time she could not possibly have understood what God was about. Yet always that quiet center in her midst that allowed her to respond to, take care of, be present to whatever God was doing, whether it was to get more wine at the wedding feast because her son was a real good winemaker, or whether it was the sorrow at the foot of the cross. We need to have that center. Our scatteredness sometimes looks like a basement where we pour all kinds of junk. We need that center. In all the busyness that's part of all our lives, there has to be a center where we are with God, a center where we can reflect with God, a little time spent each day quietly with God, so that we too can reflect what God is doing in the events that come upon us in our lives, many of which are surprises or unexpected or undesired, that we might hold that presence of God so that we can look at everything else from a deeper perspective than just being scattered and torn apart by the stuff of the world, one day after another, without any sense of what it all means, what value it has, and that God is in the midst of it all, loving us, caring for us. Mary is the great model of that. Mary is the one whom we can intercede to help us get that, help us retain that, help us not to lose that, so that we can be not all out there, but at the same time, deep reflecting on what God is doing in our hearts.